I was raised in a small rural community. Uh, well, they were Cherokee Hill people, so they were kind of clannish and insular. And even though they lived in different towns, they mostly interacted with with each other. And so that I mean, I think that experience more than anything was helpful to me when I came into intentional community because you have to learn a different set of values and a different set of behaviors on the small scale. That the dynamics of living in small groups is different. And well, I remember what story I was telling you the about me setting off the clerk at the grocery store in Leslie when I lived in Leslie, Arkansas. There was a clerk who worked at the grocery store who she was a rather rabid Yankee, and she had a couple of hot button topics that would cause her to rant and rave. And I was transacting business with her early in the morning, and I was not. I was flippant with her, and I set her off on one of her like crazy tirades. And then I got on out of there because I was busy. Well, before that was about 9:30 in the morning, and before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I had two different women in that town come to because I had a business on Main Street. Come to my business and say, "Well, thank you very much, Susan Stoddard. I heard you're the one that set Cindy Joe off this morning. It took me 15 minutes to buy some bologna." You know that
Yeah.
that they came to me and expressed their unhappiness about my lack of boundary maintenance and responsible behavior in community, and that they in fact had suffered for it, and other people had as well. And I'm saying that ethos is something that I don't find that most people in intentional communities have, and they really ought to. So when you live in small groups, you have to be, you know what I'm saying? It's like every interaction that you have with other people, somewhere or another, you have to have an awareness of what the impact of your behavior is on that person to the degree that you can. And it just seems to be something that takes people a while to learn. In small town life, people learn how to set boundaries with their friends and neighbors. And and again, I suspect that respect and boundary setting was a more important issue in the subculture in which I was raised than it is most people's, because it was Cherokee, and in general, well, for an example, Cherokee is a language in which you cannot grammatically say "I love you." In other words, the concept of you having the right to express an emotional state that gives you some power, control, or possession of another person does not grammatically exist in that language. The construct for expressing affection, it translates something to the effect of this person, the person that I am, loves the person that you are. But the actual I and the actual you are removed from the equation, which tells you volumes about the need for autonomy and the respect of personal space in that culture. I know that there's a definite ethos in that culture that there's something wrong with people who want to be around people all the time. That if you don't, that I remember old people in that culture telling me, if you can't get along with yourself, you can't get along with nobody. You know, that was a what do you call the spiritual concept, or what do you call the cultural value? And since these people spent a lot of their time making their living, and you know what I mean, like doing farm work or managing cattle or doing weaving and sewing and various things, that all that in adulthood a lot of people spend a fair amount of time alone, doing their thing, and seem to enjoy it and relish it. And again, I think that's a value that comes out of you have a small group of people who live closely together, which is what you have in intentional communities. And in order for that to work and be sane, you have to learn how to both maintain and define healthy boundaries, as well as take more responsibility for the impact of your behaviors on others. And this is where this is where you can segue into a whole discussion of white privilege, because at the end of the day, white privilege is the privilege to not consider the consequences of your behavior on other people. They did not run away. I left home. I had my own vehicle, my own employment, my own plan, and I just said I disagree with the way things are being done here, and so I'm going to go do something else. And from living in a town of 84 people to living in Manhattan. And that was probably the most extreme culture shock I ever experienced in my whole life. obviously.
What age were you when you moved to?
18.
Okay.
I left. I had been living actually from 16 to 18. I had been living in. There was a whole sequence of intentional community.
You can say anything you want about how the various communities are structured, but it seems to me that the ones that, Twin Oaks and Eastwind have these successful businesses that kind of took on a life of their own in a way.
Exactly. That you're supported. That even when that is true. And I developed the opinion a long time ago with both those places that what the founders of this place did the best was create their business model. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, I've seen this community shift its focus, its function, and its ethos radically through the years. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, people may say we've done it this way, but I've seen people's interpretations of what that way is change. You see what I'm saying? And I believe that both Eastwind and Twin Oaks were successful. I mean, in a sense, you can say the same thing about Short Mountain. Short Mountain survived because the business plan of having 2 big parties a year to pay your bills works. Sociologically speaking, Eastwind has a successful business model. But you know what I mean? That in other words, like the actual economics of the nut butter business and the way that it's operated works, and it's always worked, and that has held this place together at times when I've seen it go through upheavals that would have shattered other communities. I've seen lesser upheavals than this place have sustained shatter other communities.
Talking about mass exoduses?
Yes, yeah, I'm talking about mass exoduses and the sort of because you see nobody wants to talk about it in the intentional community, and there's shaming culture around the fact that sometimes people can't solve their problems and people leave, and sometimes a bunch of people leave at the same time. Diasporas happen,
right? Because
political schisms happen, and everybody. I mean, because I know them and don't say, well, yeah, we had that time and blah, blah, blah. It's like, honey, everybody has that time. Everybody has that time when an issue arises in the community that it's make or break. That there are people that feel so differently about an issue that the community cannot continue without achieving a negotiated settlement around that issue. And when that happens, that's what happens. And I'm saying this place has survived multiple. In my personal observation, some have been more involved in than others and seen, but this community's been involved in multiple, River Rubicon moments where it was just like that people couldn't deal. People felt so differently about something that they and I've also, quite frankly, in one of those situations, seen really toxic interpersonal politics practiced. And I'm saying that this community has continued to thrive because the basic economic dynamics are sound.
Right.
It's very interesting you should say that, because actually I was talking to JB. JB and I were having a very impassioned conversation about the function of the neighborhood at Short Mountain. Because I will tell you that Short Mountain only survived because the neighborhood happened. Do you understand what I'm saying? In other words, that when we, and I think you know the story. It started as a conventional hippie collective in 1972, the Tick Creek Collective. It got down to one person, Milo, who was the last person there. He was bi. He decided he was gay for a while. He got tired of living there by himself, so he started inviting the fairies. It became the Radical Fairies started in 78. The first Radical Fairies arrived at Short Mountain around 79-80. Taking up permanent residence. Pearlie was the first, I believe, and that was 1980 when they moved there. Anyway, he got, through an extraordinary act of generosity on the part of that's why we venerate them so much, the original founders. They signed over their share of the mortgage to Milo in 1982. to allow us to create a nonprofit. In other words, it had been a jointly held piece of land with all the adult individuals who founded the collective in
Okay.
1972, and in 1982, when Milo came up with the plan of turning it into a wildlife sanctuary nonprofit, mostly to protect the land in case the authorities came after individuals for their behaviors. You understand? So that they couldn't try to seize the land.
Yeah.
And so the founders, who had paid their own money and who had lived there, very generously signed over their property. Their right, you know what I'm saying? They've signed over their share of the assets so that it could be transferred to a nonprofit.
That's always a big moment.
Right,
and they were successfully.
Right, and Milo's a botanist. Milo happens to be the top native plant consultant for the Nature Conservancy for the Southeast. And a lot of it, he says, he got good at what he did because of the years he had to study Short Mountain because it's such a complex biome. But anyway, so but I'm saying that they struggled. I mean, it was really difficult it was like a small group of gay men living in a place that they had nobody liked them. Nobody wanted anything to do with them. They didn't even like the hippies. The community in Woodbury didn't like the hippies living up there. And it took them a while to figure out that the hippies had become hippie faggots. And when and they couldn't even wrap their mind around that. So then they started saying they were Mansonites.
Right. And I heard that lore
right.
a little bit.
Right.
So how did... Yeah.
So what happened was we had people who started coming to the community, and they started the gathering is a phenomenon that has always been a part of fairy culture because the radical fairy movement was started by a gathering. It's called the Call, and Harry Hay and his partner John and a couple of other guys put out a call in 1978 for a gathering in '79. To be held under the rules of a radical fairy gathering, and so the gathering is an essential, like the fairy gathering is the essential component of that culture, and so they quickly started hosting gatherings there. Like shortly after they got a half a dozen fairies there, they put out a call for a gathering. And they started with spring gathering. And I think they held the first spring gathering, I want to say in 1983 there. And it very quickly, because because that community had gotten a jump start because they actually inherited a community that already existed and just converted it over to basically to a new population, the Radical Fairies. Short Mountain is we are the mother community of all the Radical Fairies. I mean, that's what we're considered because we are we are unquestionably the oldest continual community. And so very quickly we started having gatherings, and that brought more people in, and that brought income in, and it brought people. The first people who settled there, we were very fortunate. We got some gay men who were from the South, who Johnny G, God bless him, rest his soul, who was from Tennessee, and he loved the community, he loved the Radical Fairy idea, but he realized that those boys were not going to make it because they didn't understand, you know what I'm saying? In other words, so we had this wonderful older gay man who was ready to retire, who bought the land right next to the land that the sanctuary had, and basically became the first gayer. You know, in other words, the first gay man who bought land up there. And Johnny G used his land and used his resources to support that community. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like he taught them the ropes of how to wheel and deal in small town southern culture, like how to do business in small town southern culture. You know, how you buy hay and how you do these things, and because they didn't know, because it was a bunch of people from away, you know.
Right.
And so I often refer to Johnny G as the fairy godmother of Short Mountain, because I don't know if the place would have survived without, you know what I mean, that his input in the early days was just critical to help them. That he was the intermediary with that community and the surrounding neighbors and the whole area, because he was a sweet, charming Southern man, and who had been in the closet his whole life, so he was accustomed to playing that role and passing in Southern society, and everybody just thought he was a sweet old man who was worried about those crazy kids living on the hill.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so he had it both ways. He got to be a part of a very empowering culture, very empowering criminal culture for himself, and at the same time go out and act like Joe Blow redneck and be below the radar for the most part. Later on, he did come. Later on, when it became less of an issue, he did come out, and he did come out in the broader community. But so Johnny G came first, and then some of the other. Some of the other people from San Francisco started. Originally, it was kind of more of, I would say, a retirement thing, like men in their 50s who bought a second house there, and then they started retiring and spending more time there. So what we had is a bunch of young people younger men living at the sanctuary, and then we had a couple of these older men with more resources who bought the land around the sanctuary, in part to be a part of the scene,
Right.
And I mean, and it wasn't like, it wasn't like they were. It was a unique moment. It was an opportunity, because I talked to him about, like, why the heck did you decide to take your life savings and buy that house on Greenwell Lane, honey? What were you thinking? And it was always about, they found a sense of community there. In other words, like, they wouldn't have bought that land if they hadn't come to Short Mountain and had a good time. And Short Mountain would still be here if those men had not come there and had a good time and decided to invest their money in buying this property. And so within, by the time I came there, by the early 90s, all of the livable structures, I mean, all the houses, all the land, the houses on it that could be purchased and rehabilitated had been rehabilitated. And so when I got there in the 90s, the next step of the neighborhood project, as I say, because the sanctuary is there, and there's a place called Greenwell Lane, and that's where Walnut Ridge, which is now, that was what it was called when it was built. It's now Sandy's Place, the Institute for Fermentation Fervor.
Okay.
Where he teaches, he has his big retreats and stuff.
Yeah, no.
Sandy bought, well, it's the next. Sandy's Place is the next piece of land adjacent to the sanctuary, and some other older fairies that had it for a long time and lived there, and they had this big plan to fix it up, and they never really had. They just lived there until they got too old to live there, and then they sold it to Sandy, and he turned it into the Fermentation Institute. But they bought up all the houses on Greenwell Lane that were livable, and then with my crew that came in. What came into the community for the first time in 93, 94 was we got the builders. James Ferguson, who was one of the founders of the farm, that's when Stephen Gaskins kicked him out, and he came to us, and he had helped the farm. What the farm is
in Tennessee.
In Tennessee, right? The big
massive community.
Yeah.
No longer. It's much smaller now.
It's much smaller now. But anyway, James Ferguson was one of the founders of that community, and had built their tofu business, and was just an incredibly, I haven't seen a single thing James Ferguson's not competent at. Well, I'm a better cook than he is, but that's about it. Anyway, so the farm kicked James out, and we got him, and this is all in the early 90s this happened. We got him, we got Keith Thompson and Sylvan, all these people who were really skilled builders. They built, like, James built the tofu machines he just literally got the plans, got the parts, got the equipment, went and saw something running, and then he built that tofu business was one of their more successful mainstream businesses at the farm, and James built the equipment for that. And so then that's when we started building the infrastructure of the community. But I'm saying the community would not have survived. The community would not have survived that first 10 years without the neighborhood. And that's something I see, like, what I was talking to, this is back to what I was talking to JB earlier this morning about, is to think about, I think that you should think about expanding while you can. There was an explosion of intentional communities starting in about really and truly about 1972. There's a few that started, there was a few projects that started before then, but really.
Yeah, Twin Oaks is 67, I think.
Yeah, Twin Oaks, there was a very early, there were some in the 60s, I know about a few like that one, but for the most part, the intentional communities boom started, as far as say, the post-Woodstock land rush.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the dates on the founding of most of the places, they're after that date. But what happened was, by when the economy took a when the economy took a downturn in the 80s, in the early 80s, that's when a lot of those communities failed. You know what I mean? They
Right.
couldn't. There was not the economy got more difficult, and they didn't have there was not the surplus to sustain their inefficiencies went away, and so the ones that were efficient at what they were doing survived, and the ones that weren't perished. And people talk about, there's certainly an element of also in the, I mean, and you have to be honest about it in telling a history, that the Reagan administration uh, made it their business to I mean, the Reagan administration, how, and you can go back and look at stuff that happened to East Wind back then too and see the same thing. In the early 80s, the Reagan administration used their enforcement authority to harass intentional communities. Do you understand?
Yeah.
They
Any
made
little.
any little thing. The IRS made it. I mean, they had a fine art of it. That was one of the ways that I learned to do. When I learned to deal with the IRS was in the 80s, because they were coming for us in the 80s. I mean, not just, it was basically, it wasn't just the intentional communities. I came across it in terms of the pagan community. Do you understand? In other words, if you had a whiff of too much pagany poo on your ass, you were going to get audited. I saw it happen all the time.
Anything related to counterculture,
Anything that
out of
was
the
right. Well, I
mainstream.
mean, I can take an example of like back in the 80s was the first time that it became a thing that it was a class of those priestesses in terms of trying to live an example and do all this stuff. It became a fad that if you were a big time high priestess in those days, you had two husbands. You know, it was just like it's like a status symbol. I don't know, but it was a thing.
Uh-huh.
And so what happened was the IRS glommed onto this, and so if you filed income tax returns and you had a woman and two men whose assets were too intensely commingled, you got pulled in for an audit. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That they were very. It wasn't just scattershot. It was very targeted. It was very targeted enforcement activities against people that they thought were, I mean, basically the people that they thought they weren't right, which were anybody in the counterculture. And Eastwind got the fuck harassed out of them back in those days. It's too bad your accountant died. He could have told you the stories. I mean, I heard about some of those. I was doing something else at the time, but I heard about some of them secondhand because I had the audacity to establish a pagan church in Arkansas in 1982. So I had I spent most of the Reagan administration being investigated by either the IRS or the FBI or both at the same time.
Gee.
Finally got so when it all came out about how intrusive they were being about monitoring our behavior, we got a class action lawsuit and we got documents released. And yes, I had an FBI agent assigned to me who was following me for months.
Jesus.
Well, that had to do with what it was. Is I was organizing protests against the Contra, funding and arming the Contras,
Mm-hmm.
and I was helping to run an organization called Witnesses for Peace, because we found out that if there were American citizens in a village, the Contras were ordered not to attack. So we organized people who were willing to volunteer to go spend a month, 6 weeks in these villages, so that the Contras wouldn't attack the villages.
Yeah.
And what came out of us doing that work was first of all, wonderful relationships were formed, and second of all, we very quickly realized these people had a terrible water problem. So those of us who participated in Witness for Peace then organized another nonprofit called, basically, that was Water for Peace, for to pause. And so what we do is like say so-and-so went and stayed in this village, and they knew this people didn't have no water, but there was a spring like this far away. So we would design a water system that was based on hydraulic ram pumps. In other words, zero maintenance, zero power. And then we would figure out exactly how much stuff we'd need. We'd raise the money to buy all the components to build them a water system, ship it down there, take a crew, and build them a water system. One, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it was like a very. It wasn't like it was a very. It was an extremely successful project, and it still goes on, by the way. As a matter of fact, there's that organization ended up doing some stuff with in Puerto Rico that I heard about, because what their whole point is, this kind of development work is people go and stay with these folks, you know, like they go spend time with these folks and figure out what's going to really work for them. You know, what's their situation, what is their unique situation in terms of their community needs around water and sanitation is what this is focused on. And now they're partnered up with the solar power project too. So now they're getting into raising money for solar power projects in those communities.
Okay.
But the whole point of the ethos behind it was, and that whole little story I told you, that is why I was targeted by the Reagan administration, because I was hobnobbing with representatives from socialist governments. I was being investigated as a potential communist operative in the United States in 1983.
In the 80s.
In the 80s,
right.
yes. And also I also had been very involved in protesting a nuclear plant in my hometown and involved in the nuclear freeze movement. I was also the state chair of the War Tax Resistance Committee. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's still goes. It's actually a project of the Quakers, but it's a way. What it is people who want to protest the amount of their taxes that go to war. Mm-hmm. You go through this whole process, and at that time, the big deal was they had a federal excise tax on telephone lines, on landlines, that all the money basically went to the Department of Defense. It was a big scam, and so the way the tax bill was written, the phone companies were required to pay the excise tax for every line they had, but you were not legally obligated to maintain your service to pay that tax to the phone company. And it was usually $1.50 a month or something. But the Quakers were big into using it as an example, so I ran this project where we educated people how to do opt-out forms on their federal excise tax on their phones, and fill out a thing saying, I'm not paying this $1.41 because it goes to war and I refuse to fund war. I will not voluntarily fund war. And we had some people who actually would take a percentage of their income tax that was due and give it to a peace organization and then have the IRS sue them, and things like that. It was a whole bunch of, it was organizing and coordinating a bunch of small nuisance actions to basically protest how much money was being spent on war and nuclear bombs. Two things that I saw that were the death knell for these intentional communities were that their economic models sucked ass,
Yeah.
because the bare brass tacks of it is every single community that is alive today that's been around for more than 10, because my experience is any pile of crap can limp along for about 10 years. Okay, I've seen it too many times. But no place that doesn't have a successful economic strategy is going to survive the next decade. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, like, people can cobble together arrangements with enough initial capital that you can keep dragging out some kind of situation for a few years after it's not doing well.
Yeah.
But that was and if you look at the dates on the rolling up the windows on a lot of those communities, it's a decade. It's like from the time they announced they began to the time they roll up the window, 10 years is a pretty common time frame for those. But so there was the two factors in the 80s that really put a dent in the intentional communities movement, and that was the changed economic circumstances and a regulatory environment that was punitive toward intentional communities. We have developed a much closer relationship with Twin Oaks and Acorn.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's not that we're hating on you guys. It's the fact that they come see us and you guys don't. And so I'm here to make sure that there's no you know what I'm saying? To make sure that everybody understands that there's no impediments. If people want to travel in the summer, they're welcome to come see us to set up all those protocols so that people from here feel as comfortable, that we've succeeded in inviting you as warmly as we have your compatriots. Ida was originally founded because the reason we were so hot to get that land is because one of the things I'm sure you noticed on the top of the mountain is we don't have a lot of arable land.
Right.
And Ida has acres of rich creek bottom land.
Okay.
And so Ida was going to be our farm. Okay. Well, what happened was the Queens ended up. It's like we were the worker bees, and all we were doing was going out and finding more work to do. And somehow or another, the people we ended up attracting for Ida, the original founders of Ida they had a circus, literally. They went out and they were performers, and they got a gig. They opened up eventually when they got good at it. They opened up for like Brooks and Dunn and all this kind of stuff. But they had a group called the Eggplant Players, which was a theatrical group, and they would produce a play every school year, and then they would get contracts with like student government, like student activity SABs, student activity boards at little colleges.
Okay.
And they would tour. Like one of their bigger hits was they did Oscar Wilde's Salome, all cross gender.
Okay.
Like all the male parts were played by women and all the women's parts were played by men. That was a huge hit. But they would do that. They would do weird, funky revival interpretations of plays, and that was literally how they supported themselves. They would get like a ton of SAB gigs. They didn't pay that much, but they would go out on the road for weeks and weeks and go hit every little college, in a couple of states.
Mm-hmm.
And that was how they were paying their bills. And then they had this circus thing that they would go and open up for country and western acts, riding unicycles and juggling flaming torches and stuff. And, well, people who do that don't want to grow onions in the bottoms, okay?
Right.
And so after a couple of frustrating years of everybody at Short Mountain getting in a vehicle and going down, I mean, you can imagine, because it was 7 miles away, going 7
those
miles.
mountain roads.
Yeah, those mountain roads, hauling everybody down there 7 miles one way and 7 miles back to go 10 fields of onions. Eventually the onion project fell by the way. And, but anyway, that the the stereotyping about, so you have a community. You have one community that actually kind of founded another community. They funded it. They sent the original members, right? Very quickly, especially after it was clear that the farming thing wasn't working out, I saw stereotyping setting in.
Yeah.
Okay. And as a matter of fact, they used to call, I kind of got testy about it because my brother was one of them, but they started calling them the Idahos, like the lazy Idahos and all this kind of stuff, like those lazy hippie faggots, those lazy artist faggots, and it was not cute. It was not cute in the sense that was also going on at the time when the worker bee syndrome was burning Short Mountain the fuck out. And, in other words, like we had the mid-90s group, we built all these things, and we built the infrastructure, but we did it at the cost of the quality of the community. A lot of conflict in these communities that people dismiss as personality conflict or communication failure is actually social role conflict. Do you understand what I mean by social role conflict?
No, do you want to expound on that?
Okay, so let's say Richard's the head of farms. Okay, he has a specific set of that is a role, and there's a specific set of expectations, both what he will do in that capacity and what's expected of him. What's expected of him in that capacity and what his responsibilities are in that capacity. Okay, well, as farm manager, there are circumstances under which, let's say, Richard would be in conflict with, say, the farm manager, theoretically. That the farm manager had an agenda about some piece of land that was different from Richard's.
Okay.
So those two people could easily get into a conflict about this real issue, which is what are we going to do with this 5 acres? Are we going to put cows? I mean, I'm just hypothetical. It's just bullshit. We're going to put cows on it, or we're going to grow food on it. Or are we going to do both? What are we going to do? And so, if Richard and the farm manager disagreed over the utilization of that 5 acres of land, and it escalated into conflict, it would be very easy for that conflict for the people involved in that conflict to perceive that, well, Richard's just a stubborn son of a bitch. He wants to farm everywhere, and we need to eat what we're growing, and these cows are worth money. You know what I'm saying? That instead of saying, oh, Richard as the farm manager is the voice for the gardens. The farm manager is the voice for the animals. Sometimes the voice for the garden and the voice for the animals are going to be saying different things in those individual capacities. But what happens in community quite often is, because Richard as the farm manager disagrees with the forest manager, the forest manager and Richard decide they don't like each other.
Yeah.
When really, it's not that they may have no conflict in personality styles otherwise, that they have a genuine principal disagreement that arises from the roles that they are fulfilling. Because if you take either one of those people out of that role, that conflict, that's what I'm saying, that's my definition of a social role, is a conflict that emerges between two people because of the responsibilities and expectations of the roles that they've taken on in the community. And then if you take one of those people out of that role, then the conflict will be de-escalated, but then it will emerge again with the next person you put into that role. It's actually pronounced Sasa, which is Cherokee for female goose.
Okay.
It was my nickname, my childhood nickname from my Cherokee grandmother, because I was not the most graceful child in the world.